Thank you for you guys for bearing the cold and coming to my lecture recital. I really appreciate it. For those of you watching online as well, thank you for tuning in. My name is Alan, and today I'll be presenting my lecture recital, Schubert's Fantasia in F minor D 940, Tragedy upon Reminiscence. I met my best friend Garrett during our first year of college. We were suite mates with two other guys and both studied in non-music fields. He was an amateur musician, having played the trumpet in high school, but I quickly realized his extensive knowledge of and immense enthusiasm for classical music. One day, I asked him what was his favorite piano piece, to which he replied, Schubert's Fantasia in F minor. I, the ignorant solo pianist, had not heard the one-piano four-hand piece before. Over the next 4 years, as Garrett and I had our undergraduate adventures, the Fantasia would become one of my favorite works due to its unforgettable theme, feelings of nostalgia, dramatic intensity, creative harmonic shifts, and a recapitulation full of longing. Garrett inspired me to arrange the Fantasia for two hands to use in my own performances. In 2013, I premiered the first version of the solo Fantasia. It was decent, but I was not completely satisfied and shelved it for the next 5 years. I decided to bring back the Fantasia for this lecture recital for several reasons, one of which was to overhaul my previous arrangement into something as close to the original as possible. This time I'm quite satisfied, although playing this version is much more challenging than performing the previous. I also wanted to formalize why I feel these longing emotions, a yearning for the past, while experiencing the Fantasia, especially towards the end of the piece. Finally, since four-hand concerts are exceedingly rare these days, I wanted to present this seldomly heard masterpiece from the duet repertoire to the public. Although this lecture recital is a formal presentation, I hope it will evoke the more intimate and private atmosphere of Schubertiads that were so popular in Vienna in the early 19th century. Before discussing memory and the Fantasia, I would like to talk about the significance of duet and salon music in Schubert's time compared to today. Schubert's piano duets hold unusual prominence in his oeuvre due to their volume, scope, and creativity. Most musicological books on Schubert separate his piano solo and duet compositions in the indices in two separate categories. In addition, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians includes the following in its definition of piano duet. Quote, although the one piano duet has the larger repertory, it has come to be regarded as a modest, essentially domestic branch of music compared with the more glamorous two-piano duet. Schubert was the one great composer to write extensively for the medium. Schubert dabbled with the genre early in his composition career, but began truly embracing it in 1818 with a rondo, 4 polonaises, a sonata, and 3 marches militaires. In 1824, he composed several expansive multi-movement duets with the Grand Duo and Divertissement à l'Hongroise. And in his last year, Schubert wrote several enduring four-hand works, including the Fantasia, Allegro in A minor, and Rondo in A major. But merely listing and analyzing the scores will not explain how piano duets became a central composition genre for Schubert. Instead, comprehending the duet's significance begins with understanding the music-making process in Vienna at the turn of the 19th century. Public concert life in Vienna in the early 19th century featured individual virtuosi managing their own performances and events held by music societies. 3 primary societies existed: Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, Gesellschaft des Privatmusikvereins, and Concerts Spirituels einer Gesellschaft von Musikfreunden. The first, Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, otherwise known as Musikverein, played an especially important role in Viennese musical life. It hosted seasonal orchestral concerts as well as less formal Abendunterhaltung, which presented chamber works, operatic arias, and ensemble pieces, and lieder. Schubert was rejected from the Musikverein when he first applied in 1818, but after establishing himself as an esteemed composer, he was accepted in 1821. He had only 2 of his large-scale works performed at the Musikverein's orchestral concerts, but found much more success in the Abendunterhaltung. Partially due to Schubert becoming a board member in 1825, the frequency of performances of his chamber compositions in the Abendunterhaltung increased to the point where he was the second most played composer, behind Rossini, but ahead of Mozart and Beethoven. Schubert's public orchestral performances, on the other hand, were extremely scarce. Otto Biba argues that Schubert suffered from, quote, an inordinate shyness, and perhaps even discouraged such public orchestral performances. Schubert was certainly more inclined towards domestic music making than public concerts. He played in a string quartet with his family and friends in his teenage years, while still an assistant at the Himmelfortgrund elementary school. This ensemble eventually grew too big for rehearsals in the classroom, and they moved to a larger space in the city where they could rehearse orchestral works. Many of Schubert's early orchestral compositions were played for the first time in this private setting with friends and colleagues. Schubert's orchestral works were also performed in musical salons, which were the mainstay of musical life in Vienna. These semi-private events, hosted by members of the middle class and aristocracy, occurred more frequently than concerts organized by musical societies. Repertoire for salons were mostly chamber works, including Lieder, but small orchestras of a couple dozen musicians played larger works. Schubert was able to hear performances of his first, second, third, fifth, and sixth symphonies at salons hosted by Otto Hattfig. The most frequent performances of Schubert's compositions occurred at Schubertiads, a subset of Viennese salons. These events typically included eating, drinking, dancing, and recitations, in addition to the playing of almost exclusively Schubert's music. He was often the center behind the performances, accompanying singers, frequently his good friend baritone Johann Michael Vogel, singing or improvising, or playing keyboard duets. A fairly large Schubertiad on December 15, 1826, occurred at Joseph von Spahn's home, with guests including government officials and Schubert's friends, the previously mentioned Vogel, Johann Meerhofer, and Eduard von Bauernfeld, among others. Vogel sang around 30 songs while Schubert played several of his duets late into the night. Schubert's music making in domestic settings was a social experience very different from modern performance halls that house the majority of classical performances today. Schubert had contemplated a public Schubertiad in 1823 consisting of solely his music. Until 1828, all public performances of Schubert's work had occurred with a mix of other composers' works, either as part of a music society event or a program from an established touring artist. A public concert finally came into fruition months before Schubert's death on March 26, 1828, 1 year after Beethoven's passing. The concert was held at the Gesellschaft Music Society's concert hall and consisted of the first movement of the G major quartet, the E-flat piano trio, 4 songs performed by Vogel, and several vocal works. Originally, the Fantasia in F minor was planned to be included in the program, but it was cut because Schubert had not finished revising the work. He ended up completing it several weeks later. The event was a massive success, with Schubert pocketing 800 gulden, more than 3 times the salary his father earned teaching per year. And many admirers wrote to the Wiener Zeitschrift publication for repeat performance. Alas, no subsequent performance ever occurred, as Schubert's health rapidly deteriorated beginning in the summer of 1828. Throughout his life, Schubert had shown strong proclivity for intimate, more domestic musical gatherings, as represented by countless salon and Schubertiad performances of his Lieder, chamber works, and duets. The role of the one piano duet is historically more domestically inclined, serving as a method for musical intimacy in the living room, or recreating symphonic experiences via transcriptions. Modern-day musicking marginalizes the one-piano duet in public concerts in favor of symphonies, concerti, solo recitals, often with piano accompaniment, and various string or wind chamber works. Only a select few piano duos have made it into the musical limelight, such as Melvin Stecker and Norman Horowitz in the mid-20th century, and Greg Anderson and Elizabeth Joy Rowe today. John Reed laments of the Fantasia in F minor, quote, "It is unfortunate in one sense that one of Schubert's greatest works is written for the now unfashionable medium of piano duet, for the Fantasia is possibly the best example of its composer's mature keyboard style. Its only chance of public performance comes with a duo recital." In arranging the Fantasia, I wish to share this work with a wider audience without the hurdles of organizing a concert for a, quote, unfashionable medium. I hope this lecture recital will present itself less like a cold, one-way communication that defines so many present-day classical concerts, and more like a hybrid between a formal presentation and intimate Schubertiade. Schubert's late compositions focus on two predominant themes, death and memory. Before his final years, Schubert explored the concept of death in his Lieder, either with some supernatural force, as in Der Erlkönig, or implied suicide in Die schöne Müllerin. The aura of death carries forward to his instrumental works as well, such as the first movement of the unfinished symphony, which, as Jürgen Timm puts it, quote, forges a path relentlessly and without mercy towards a tragic denouement. These chilling evocations become more prevalent and associated with Schubert's music during his last few years, perhaps best exemplified by Winterreise, which, according to Schubert's close acquaintance Joseph von Spahn, contributed to his early death. Winterreise also provides a starting point to discuss memory in Schubert's late music. Memory as a tangible musical component is not easily quantifiable. As Walter Frisch asks, quote, whose memory is active? Is it that of the present-day listener, the performers, the historical composer, or some other persona? In Winterreise, it is clear that another persona, the wandering protagonist of the cycle, refers to his memories through song lyrics. For example, in the first song, Gute Nacht, the protagonist bids farewell to a failed relationship in the past. Schubert's musical accompaniment imitates the trudging footsteps of the wanderer, yet the despondency and reminiscence of the past are already clear from poet Wilhelm Müller's text. Memory in Schubert's instrumental works is more subtle and often much more subjective than in Lieder due to the lack of verbal references. Robert Schumann wrote a review of Schubert's four impromptus D 935 in the Neue Zeitschrift in December 1838, relying on highly romantic feeling to explain nostalgic evocations. Schumann writes that the first and second impromptus provide, quote, one more beautiful memory of Schubert. The first impromptu, quote, was conceived in an hour of suffering as if musing on the past. And the second impromptu, quote, has the more meditative character we often find in Schubert's works. John Deverio expounds on Schumann's intuition in similar rhetoric, describing sections of the first impromptu as, quote, tentative and disembodied, with repeated notes trying to take form. One could and should justify these feelings of memory with a more technical analysis involving harmony, rhythm, motivic ideas, and textures. However, for Schumann, it was the feeling of the, quote, temporality of pastness that prompted his review, and Deverio attempts to formalize that same feeling through analytical means. In the Fantasia, perhaps the most unforgettable feature is the opening melody in F minor. This melody occurs throughout the entirety of the first movement and is hauntingly reprised at the beginning and end of the fourth. For now, I want to just focus on the first movement, as the revocations in the fourth movement tap into structural memory built from the narrative progression of the Fantasia over all four movements, as opposed to the immediate pathos felt at the beginning. In the first few measures, Schubert introduces an evocative theme consisting of a consistent rhythmic pulse, dotted rhythm, and a distinctive leap of a perfect fourth in the melody. Here is the opening theme for you to hear. I will be demonstrating excerpts with Zhiye, using the four-hand score so everyone can experience, however briefly, Schubert's original intentions and contrast it with my arrangement. To me, the relatively large leap of a perfect fourth carries both a physical and emotional emptiness. Of course, the accompaniment gestures in the lower voices fill out the harmonies, but I believe the space between the initial C and F in the melody helps evoke a personal loneliness that pervades the opening movement. In addition, the contour of the main theme is quite unusual in that the presentation for measures 3 to 8 is entirely descending in a large-scale sighing motion. The emotional pitch and volume peak of this first phrase derives from the leap to the opening high F. The continuation introduces a leap of a fifth that helps increase the tension, but this leap also peaks on the same high F in measure 11. The harmony in measure 11, a first inversion B-flat minor chord, potentially implies a modulation to a more optimistic area of A-flat major. In fact, Schubert undergoes this exact harmonic shift at measure 22, yet is subverted in this opening as the bass falls back to a dominant C. This opening theme might also have some allusions to other works, which can evoke a musical reminiscence not uncommon in Schubert's other late compositions. In Schubert's piano sonata in C minor, D958, Charles Fisk notes that the theme of the second movement, Adagio, echoes the opening vocal phrase of the 21st song of Winterreise, Das Wursthaus. In the same sonata, Fisk also mentions similarities harmonically to Gefreune Tränen, melodically to Gut Nacht, gesturally to Auf dem Fluss, and cadentially to Der Wegweiser, all from Winterreise. Musical allusions are not restricted to works by the same composer. The opening of Schubert's piano sonata in C minor strongly recalls Beethoven's 32 variations in C minor. Fisk interprets Schubert's recollections in the C minor piano sonata as those of Schubert himself, quote, the winter wanderer, the aimless, outcast, and irredeemably lonely protagonist of Winterreise, made all the more distinct by juxtaposing it next to that of Beethoven. Although the Fantasia's opening melody likely does not allude to specific musical works, William Kinderman sees a similar processional character in Gut Nacht and Wegweiser from Winterreise. and the C major symphony Andante. Meanwhile, Susan Wallenberg finds the perfect fourth leaps to have, quote, recitative-like qualities in the expressive rising and falling figures of the melody, similar to other pathos-exuding arias like Barberina's Ho Perduto from Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro. William Kinderman hears in the Fantasia in F minor, quote, a sense of progress towards an inescapable destiny, an idea tied to the universal human theme of mortality. To me, this statement describing events leading towards a goal strongly suggests a narrative, not necessarily tied to a specific story, but one involving specific musical objectives. The Fantasia's narrative aims towards the fourth movement, which begins with a retelling of the first movement and closes with an evolution of the opening theme. This coda is one of the most tragic endings to any musical work, but the sorrow felt is much more than the sum of its components. Rather, the ending is the culmination of various structural, harmonic, and motivic memories throughout the piece. Before we move any further, let me play for you the ending of the piece. In attempting to discern why this coda is so heartbreaking, let us first discuss external structure. Recalling specific musical forms allow listeners to organize either a set of smaller pieces, like the impromptus, or a more diffuse work, like the Fantasia. For example, Schumann considered Schubert's first, second, and perhaps fourth impromptus as movements of a sonata, despite their innocuous genre label. Following Schumann's review, some more recent scholars, such as Alfred Einstein and Walter Dürr, have interpreted all four impromptus as part of a sonata cycle. The Fantasia consists of four movements contributing to a unified whole: Allegro molto moderato, Largo, Scherzo allegro vivace, and Finale, Allegro molto moderato. This schema immediately recalls that of the sonata, with Schubert's last three piano sonatas, D 958 to 960, all in the same format. But the work that most closely relates to the Fantasia is Schubert's most popular solo keyboard fantasy, the Wanderer Fantasy in C major, written in 1822. The Fantasia for four hands has distinct formal similarities to the Wanderer Fantasy. In addition to sharing the fantasy name, both pieces portray lamenting with their themes, with the second movement of the Wanderer Fantasy fully displaying the protagonist's sorrow and pain. The minor Neapolitan, which acts as the tonal center of the second and third movements of the Fantasia, is also significant in the second movement of the Wanderer, with its tonal center of C sharp minor, up a half step from the opening C major. Most significant to this discussion, both pieces have a nearly identical four-movement structure: allegro, slow movement, scherzo, and a concluding fugue. The three late piano sonatas all have rondo finales, but Schubert specifically wrote fugues in the Wanderer and F minor for the Wanderer is similar in emotional progression to that of the Fantasia. It relentlessly builds until reaching a climax on a half cadence. In the Wanderer, Schubert extends this energy towards a powerful conclusion with rapidly cascading C major arpeggios in triple forte dynamics, whereas in the Fantasia, he resists this temptation by pulling back to the sorrowful opening theme in piano dynamics. Even if we were to consider the Fantasia's ending as having no relation to the rest of the piece, it still stands as extremely unusual compared to the rest of Schubert's late four-movement keyboard works. The Wanderer Fantasy and the last three sonatas all finish with energetic codas, surpassing prior excitement levels in their respective fourth movements. Compared to these pieces, the ending of the Fantasia in F minor is both a literal and figurative outcast. Literally, in the way it foils expectations of a rousing finish, and figuratively in the way it recalls the solitude and lamentation of the initial theme. Focusing more on specific elements of the Fantasia's composition, two major factors contribute towards the reminiscent and sorrowful qualities of the fourth movement reprise. The harmonic deviations in the second and third movements, and the absence of resolved half cadences after the first movement. While discussing these components, I'll be providing a brief overview of the themes and structures of the Fantasia's four movements. The form of the Fantasia's first movement in F minor is rather ambiguous. Some writers, such as Patrick McCrellis, have suggested that the opening allegro falls neatly as a large-scale sonata form, like that of the Wanderer Fantasy, whereas Zhiye also considers variation, ternary, and double ternary forms as factors. If the pensive theme from example 1 can be considered material for an A section, Schubert also introduces in this movement a violent funeral march as a B section, which will later be used as the subject of the fourth movement's fugue. Here is the B section of the first movement. The A and B themes alternate throughout the first movement before reaching a coda in F major. This coda is significant in two regards. First is the last time Schubert presents F major or minor before the beginning of the fourth movement. Second, it marks the last time a movement will conclude with a perfect, authentic cadence until the end of the piece. The second movement is a largo in F sharp minor, and harmonically the minor Neapolitan of F minor. Schubert transitions abruptly to this new tonal region by brute force, simply moving the appropriate tones from F major up a half step. The structure of the second movement is in simple ternary, with the outer sections featuring double dot rhythms reminiscent of a French overture, and the leap of the perfect fourth recalling that of the opening theme. The largo's middle section presents a lyrical duet between an upper and lower voice in F sharp major. Here is the transition to and the opening of the second movement. The largo concludes with a half cadence in forte on a C sharp major dominant chord, poised to resolve to F sharp minor. It does not resolve to tonic, but instead leads directly to the third movement, an allegro vivace scherzo trio form also centered around F sharp minor. The energetic theme of the scherzo is probably the second most remembered of the Fantasia, next to the F minor opening. Although this melody does not have any extraordinary pathos that stirs up feelings of loneliness, it becomes memorable because it is repeated ad nauseum 9 times in the movement. This repetition combines with the middle movement's foreign F sharp minor tonal region to cause listeners to temporarily forget the F minor opening theme. Here is the theme of the third movement. The fourth movement begins with 36 measures of the first movement's opening theme, a literal retelling of the beginning. Although the notes are exactly the same, the feeling is somehow more profound. We have endured a long journey through the tumultuous sea of F sharp minor, and the return of the F minor theme reflects these struggles. The return of the opening theme, however, does not provide closure after the third movement's half cadence, but rather serves as a continuation towards the ultimate destination, that is, the coda. After the reprise of the opening A material, Schubert replaces the violent B section with a lengthy four-voice fugue based on the B section's theme. He forgoes alternating the two sections like in the first movement, and instead uses the B theme's energy to propel the fugue towards a climax on a powerful, dominant C major prolongation. As mentioned before, we expect Schubert to carry this energy forward into the coda like he does in The Wanderer and the last three sonatas, but he instead halts all of this previously built momentum in its tracks with yet another unresolved cadence. After a one-measure grand pause, the coda begins. For the last time, we hear the somber F minor procession, but only as a brief fragment before it transforms towards an even more tragic closure from various structural, harmonic, and motivic recollections. We have discussed how formal expectations, foreign harmonic areas, and lack of cadential resolution cause the fourth movement, and specifically the coda, to feel especially isolated and tragic. The coda is not a strict reiteration of the opening theme, instead evolving it with specific localized devices for a decisive cathartic conclusion. Returning to the impromptus, Charles Fisk notes various formal methods of connecting the pieces as part of a larger cycle, one of which is harmonic memory. For example, Fisk argues that the D flat major 1-4-1 progression in the second impromptu cyclically relates to the same progression in the first impromptu, and recalls the instance, quote, to raise the hope of another, more abiding catharsis. In the Fantasia, Schubert connects local G-flat major Neapolitan chords with a global F-sharp minor Neapolitan structure, allowing for a Schenkerian unification of all the movements. The first local instance occurs at measure 20 in the first movement, where instead of using a 2 diminished predominant chord, Schubert substitutes it with a G-flat major N6. The Neapolitan harmony seems rather innocuous until measures 31 to 36, in which Schubert prolongs a N6 to 5 prolongation for 3 iterations, further solidifying its significance. Returning now to the coda, immediately after a brief repeat of the main F minor theme, Schubert begins to transform the theme into the denouement. A local tonicization of the Neapolitan G-flat major appears for measures 561 to 563, which adds a layer of harmonic recollection that helps unify the ending. One final type of musical illusion occurs with thematic or motivic memory between movements, which differs from the harmonic memory we just discussed. For example, in the first movement of the piano sonata in C minor, Charles Fisk notes that the melodic material immediately following the opening's large descending A-flat scale outlines a progression that is the same as the first four measures of the second movement. These inter-movement recollections can help unify work on deeper levels and allow musicians to perceive the work cyclically. Although Schubert wrote several motivic gestures in the Fantasia, perhaps the most prominent linear idea connecting the coda to the rest of the work is a half-step descending D-flat to C. The D-flat is almost always an upper neighbor to the C that outlines a dominant harmony, such as in the bass from measures 11 to 12, and immediately afterwards in the melody in measure 13. Both the half-step interval and dominant arrival make this motive highly expressively yearning. Although D-flat to C gestures occur occasionally during the first movement and fourth movement reprise, Schubert increases the motive's presence in the fourth movement fugue with at least 4 highly localized gestures. Each of these moments is fleeting and seemingly insignificant until the coda, which prominently features this motive 3 times in the final 10 measures. Twice in the bass, and once in the upper voices. This increased motivic frequency adds another layer of memory to those of the main theme and Neapolitan harmony to give the Fantasia one of the most devastatingly hopeless endings in all of music literature. The feeling of memory does not lie exclusively with the composer Schubert or some other persona like the Wanderer, but also with the audience. Walter Frisch believes that the subject who recalls in most of Schubert's late instrumental works, quote, is an active, highly suggestible listener whose memories seem to create or be played out in the music. For Frisch, the listener's habitual memory of musical syntactic elements like phrase structure, form, and harmonic progressions combines with their own recollective memories to contribute to their expectations and affectations. From this discourse, the only definitive conclusion is that memory is inherently subjective, and scholars have used a variety of analyses to explain it in Schubert's music. At every major junction after the first movement, progress and harmonic resolution is thwarted in the Fantasia. The second and third movements expand upon local Neapolitan harmonies which destabilize the initial theme and tonal center in F minor. The inescapable opening theme returns at last in the fourth movement, somehow more foreign than before, given that it follows that extended period in F sharp minor. It leads to a dramatically building, yet ultimately inconclusive fugue, ending in yet another half cadence, a culmination of the Fantasia's lack of harmonic resolution. Only in the heartbreaking coda does Schubert unify so many musical and emotional elements. The main theme, Neapolitan chord, neighboring motive, and at last a conclusive, if fatalistic, cadence. Thank you. Before we move on to the performance part, I would like to thank a few people, first of which are my family, who may or may not be watching from the interwebs. Thank you for your continued support through my musical journey, and it's really greatly appreciated. Also many thanks to my teacher, Ms. Peck, who unfortunately is stuck in New York because of bad weather, cold weather. Thank you for your caring and support and patience with my playing. Last, thank you, Dr. McClary, who was my advisor with the whole research and document part. Unfortunately, she could not make it either, but thank you for your support and for guiding me and helping me focus with your infinite wisdom. And I guess lastly but not least, thank you for everyone who's showed up today in this cold weather. Not many people, but enough to make it kind of an intimate Schubertian and hopefully slightly less nerve-wracking for me to play. So thank you, and thank you for everyone for tuning in as well. We're going to take a short 10-minute break. Hopefully we'll get the piano tuner in here, we'll rearrange the stage a little bit, and we'll get to the play. Thank you.